Good morning, and welcome to our fifth lecture within the series 7 Months, 7 Universities. This is a series of guest lectures focused on specific topics related to language and culture, and offered in the framework of Subline 4.8 of Action Line 4 for Arqus, Multilingual and Multicultural University. As you probably know, Arqus is a multilateral alliance of universities who share academic, scientific, and cultural objectives, a common vision of the role of higher education and research, and mutual fields of interest. It brings together the universities of Bergen, Granada, Graz, Leipzig, Lyon, Padua, and Vilnius, 7 long-standing comprehensive research universities. Before giving the floor to Barbara Gedeke from the University of Padua, who will be introducing our lecture and our guest lecturer today, please let me tell you that if you have any questions or any comments, they will be answered at the end of the lecture. Just leave them on the chat. Thank you very much and enjoy your lecture. Barbara, the floor, or rather the screen is yours.
Thank you, Guadalupe, and thank you for joining us today for this opportunity to present the University of Padua for the 5th month of this Arqus initiative with today's lecture. I'm Barbara Gödecke from Padua University, and I'm involved in Arqus activities related to multilingualism and interculturalism. And I have the pleasure of introducing to you today's lecturer, Francesca Helm. Francesca is a researcher at the Department of Political Science, Law, and International Studies at the University of Padua, and her research interests are in intercultural dialogue, virtual exchange, technology in education, language and education policies, and ethical internationalization of higher education, including English medium instruction. As you may already know, Francesca is chair of the Education Innovation Working Group of the Coimbra Group, and she is leading the monitoring and evaluation of the Erasmus Plus Virtual Exchange Pilot Project, a project that engages the dialogue between young people in Europe and in the Southern Mediterranean region throughout virtual exchange. Francesca is also a founding member and co-coordinator of the Italian section of Scholars at Risk. As a language teacher and a frequent user of Wikipedia, I'm very curious to hear her talk harnessing students' multilingualism in English medium classes through Wikipedia editing. And so I'm happy now to give the virtual floor to Francesca. Francesca, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Guadalupe. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for inviting me to give this talk. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Wikipedia, and I'm glad you said you're a frequent user of Wikipedia, Barbara. I think a lot of us are users of Wikipedia, but I just want to start by asking some questions about Wikipedia. Do you know, and I'll ask you to write in the chat if you're watching, who created Wikipedia and when? Anybody? Oh, wait a second to see if anybody writes in the chat. Oops, I can't see. Nobody's written anything yet. Okay, so maybe people don't know so much who created it and when. Sorry. How many different language Wikipedias are there? Does anybody know? These are some questions which perhaps people. Barbara in the other chat. I can't see any replies in the chat, but never mind. Okay, just some questions to think about. No clue. Thank you, Adolfo. Okay, well, those of you, I've done this exercise with students, and so they find the answers very quickly. And then so Wikipedia was actually created 20 years ago by Jimmy Wales and Larry Sanger. It's celebrating 20 years now. there are actually 321 editions of Wikipedia, but but 310 are actually active now. 11 have been closed. When I do this activity with students, they very often find me the answers very quickly. And then when I ask them, where did you find this answer? They say, Wikipedia, of course, because that's where they get the information. In terms of the size of Wikipedia, I ask if this is true or false. There are approximately 6 million articles on Wikipedia. But actually, this is false, because there are just over 6 million articles on English Wikipedia, but there are actually 55 million articles in the 310 languages of Wikipedia. So it is actually an enormous resource, and even just the English Wikipedia has 90 times as many words as the Encyclopedia Britannica. So in terms of volume, there is a lot of information. What people are criticized and are wary of is the quality of the information on Wikipedia and where it comes from. And this is something that I want to address a little bit today. And I think it's very important that people understand more about Wikipedia, because I don't know if you know where it ranks in terms of the top visited websites, but actually it is, there are various statistics depending on where you look. The most recent one I looked at on statista.com said it is the 4th most visited website. And so though many people might deny using it, or criticize the knowledge production on Wikipedia, it is actually one of the most top visited websites. And I think for this reason, it's very important to have a better understanding of what Wikipedia is and how it works. And I'm just going to say a little bit about how I use it and why I use it in my teaching context. I know the title of the talk is Harnessing Multilingualism, but I teach in an English taught course, so it's Harnessing Multilingualism in English medium classes. And I teach in the second cycle degree course, European and Global Studies. And the name of my course is, well, it was English as a Global Language, but it's going to be English as a Glocal Language, where we look at the spread of English from a critical perspective. And I have usually 50% international students from various neighboring countries. We have Turkey, Russia, Ukraine, a really wide range of languages, and Italian. And I think, one of the most amazing things about teaching on this kind of course is precisely the exchange we can have amongst the students. And this is why it's important to draw on students' resources and knowledge in their languages as well. And so the aims of the course, this is just a slide from the course page. Students will acquire an understanding of the relations between language and power, and of the historic, political, and economic factors that have led towards the spread of English in certain contexts. A critical awareness of the origins and implications of different conceptualizations of English, for example, the idea of English as a global language, the language of imperialism and neoliberalism, a lingua franca, a lingua academica, a global language, also a language of resistance and solidarity. So there are multiple ways in which English can be conceptualized. But we focus in particular on how English relates to linguistic diversity and social justice or social injustice. And one of the things I've kind of been looking at with the students is this idea of ecology of knowledge or ecology of knowledges. And so the aims of the Wikipedia project in this sense is, first of all, for students to understand better how Wikipedia actually works and the philosophy behind it. It's actually one of the nicest spaces, if you like, on the internet in terms of it doesn't have advertising, it's very open. In terms of all the information, all edits, everything is visible on it. And it works on a collaborative ethos. Also, in terms of language, it was important for them to learn to write in a clear manner for a general audience. In Wikipedia, you have to cite sources, and so this was a way for them to learn to cite sources, so preparing for also academic writing. And also, I believe it's important for students to learn to collaborate in a team on a specific project. More specifically on Wikipedia, I wanted them to critically explore the presence and use of different languages in Wikipedia. So one of the things we did was explore, articles in Wikipedia and the different information that was made available in different languages and how this information differed in the language and why. Also, the relationship between languages. For example, in which language was the article started? Was it translated from one language to another? Or do the different articles in different languages exist separately? Do they develop separately? Another thing I wanted to engage with is this idea of objectivity and neutrality. To what extent is that possible? I mean, is Wikipedia neutral? Are encyclopedias neutral in terms of knowledge? I mean, many would criticize these objectivist claims, saying that all knowledge is situated. And this was one of the concepts I wanted to engage with, but also giving them the tools and the power to be able to contribute to a healthier ecology of knowledge. One of the great things about Wikipedia is once you learn how to edit, then you can continue contributing to this vast encyclopedia. And so on this idea of an ecology of knowledge, it has been said by some scholars that particularly the campaigners of this group called Whose Knowledge, that Wikipedia is a good proxy for online public knowledge. Okay, so if we consider that now over 50% of the world is online, over 50% of women in the world are now online, and actually 75% of people online are from the global south. Yet, only 20% of the world, and primarily white male editors from North America and Europe, edits 80% of Wikipedia. Okay, so though in principle Wikipedia is open, you know, the idea is that anybody can edit Wikipedia articles without even having an account. You need to have an account on Wikipedia to be able to create a new article, but actually anybody can edit an article. Despite this apparent openness, you know, it was created by white men from North America, and this kind of hegemony is reproduced in Wikipedia. Only 1 in 10 editors are female. There are more articles written about Antarctica than about most countries in Africa and Latin America and Asia. So in terms of what knowledge is made relevant on Wikipedia, there is a strong imbalance which reflects the editors and where they're coming from. And less than 1/4 of all Wikipedia biographies today represent women. And this isn't only the case in English, this is the case in nearly every language version of Wikipedia. So there are, you know, problems with Wikipedia. We can criticize it as an encyclopedia, just as we can criticize other encyclopedias. But what is interesting about Wikipedia is that students can contribute to changing this. And Wikipedia has also become aware of the limitations of it, of, you know, the bias that's inherent in Wikipedia itself. And there have been many outreach projects in order to engage more diverse people from different countries to start editing Wikipedia and to change the dynamic and to change the ecology of knowledge, if you like. And so how did I organize the editing project with students? I organized them into groups of 3 or 4 multilingual groups. So we would have 1 or 2 Italian students with 1 or 2 international students. And we would decide on topics, and then they would analyze the pages in the different languages on the group. So first of all, we started this on topics that they were interested in as a group. So they would explore some themes that they decided on, and they would compare the pages in different languages. What information was available, if it was available in each of their languages, and how the information was presented. Then we decided on a topic for the class, and what the very first project we decided on was looking at language policies and English medium policies in different countries. And so there the students did research in their own languages and found information about language-related policies in their countries. So here it was harnessing their multilingualism in the sense that they were doing research in their own languages, which they then brought back to share with the group in English in the course. And then idea was that they were going to write a draft not a whole article, but they were going to write paragraphs on some of the Wikipedia pages about language policies in different countries. Very importantly is that we worked with a Wikimedian. So I don't know if you know, but there is Wikipedia, but there's also the NGO, if you like, Wikimedia. And they work with educational institutions, so, you know, schools, universities, also libraries, city councils, museums, and they do workshops about how to edit Wikipedia. So we had a workshop with Marco Camello, who was our Wikimedian, and he gave the students an overview of what Wikipedia is, the 5 pillars of Wikipedia, because Wikipedia has rules of engagement. And then we did a very hands-on workshop on editing Wikipedia pages. Students created a sandbox. They created their own accounts. They created a sandbox. And in groups, they all started working on one of the students' sandboxes. And then when they had finished preparing their articles, then Marco, the Wikimedian, I would review for the content and for the language. And then we had another session with the Wikimedian, and he reviewed the technical aspects, if you like, of their student pages, which were still in their sandboxes, and he supported the transfer from the student sandbox to the actual Wikipedia page, where then the paragraphs the students wrote would be published and could be edited, could be removed, they could be approved by the Wikipedia community. I'm not going to show their articles now because they've kind of got lost in Wikipedia, but I'll talk a little bit about the challenges and then how this project was followed up. I mean, it was a difficult project because I had a high number of students, and the course was quite short. It was a 40-hour course, and students also had to do other things. So Wikipedia editing does take a lot of time because if you want students to explore it, to understand it, and also to learn to edit. Deciding on which topics to edit was a problem, because then sometimes students might not be interested. So it's important, on the one hand, to find topics that students are interested in, because that will engage them more. But on the other hand, there needs to be some kind of uniformity within the group. They need to do something similar, otherwise it's difficult to manage. Students wrote paragraphs, but not all of them were of sufficient quality to be published. Some of them had copied and pasted from other pages and sources and were thus removed from Wikipedia because you're not allowed to do that. So there were some issues, and also my lack of experience with Wikipedia in the beginning was a problem. I found myself having difficulty in not being able to support them enough. The students were translated, from languages that I and Marco were not familiar with, and some also translated into languages that we were not familiar with. But I think that's part of the richness of this project. I mean, it's a challenge, but it's also the richness of the project. And then, of course, inevitably with group work, there are group dynamics. So some people find it difficult to work in a group, some people weren't putting their weight in the group, etc. So it was a challenging project. I did it in 2018, 2019, first of all. But it was also very positive. In particular, I want to talk about the Followup project that I did, which was another course, a Students at Risk Advocacy seminar, which a small number of students from the previous course took part in. And this advocacy seminar entails students doing research about scholars who have been arrested and imprisoned in their countries, and the students have to develop an advocacy campaign. As you can see from the date of this presentation, the advocacy seminar ran from March to June 2020, which was right at the outbreak of the COVID pandemic. So it shifted from being a face-to-face course to an online course in a moment which was actually quite difficult and challenging for everybody. We had international students, so from Afghanistan, from Brazil, Indonesia, Iran, Italy, Russia, Thailand, Ukraine. And what heartened me very much was that the students themselves suggested working on Wikipedia. Now, Wikipedia is an encyclopedia. It's not a traditional tool of advocacy, but there were Wikipedia entries on these two scholars, Ahmad Reza Jalali and Nicola Bayani. So there were pages on Wikipedia about the scholars. What the students decided to do was to expand on the pages, because there was actually only one line in English about each of the scholars, 1 or 2 sentences perhaps. And they wrote quite detailed pages on the cases of the scholars, and they also translated them into other languages. We also had a student from Iran who read Farsi, and she supported the students in understanding, because about Nilufar Bayani, there was quite a long Wikipedia page in Farsi. So she translated the information from that for the Italian students. The Italian and international students together prepared pages in English and then translated them into Italian, Thai, Russian, and Ukrainian languages. And here, I don't know if you can see very well, but this is the page for Ahmad Reza Jalali. And when they created the page, it was actually visible, maybe visited 20, 30, 40 times a day, but not really a lot. They worked a great deal on the page. As you can see, they've worked on his academic content, sentence, his health condition, and the various campaigns that have been carried out with regular updates on his case. What you can see below in this part of the page, this is visualizations of the page per month. So in November last year, Dr. Jalali was taken into solitary confinement and with a view to his imminent execution. And so there was a lot of media attention on his case. And you can see the visualizations of the Wikipedia page shooted right up, and there was about 16,000 pages per month in the months of November and December. And since then, visualizations of the pages have been high. So the students were very satisfied in this terrible and tragic situation. They were satisfied with the campaign in the sense that they had actually gathered information together on the cases, translated it also into different languages, so making it available to people in different areas, and giving quality information, because that is also an important part of advocacy work. Here we have the page on Nilufar Bayani, who was the wildlife activist, and here most of the work was translating from Farsi into English and Italian, because there wasn't much information about her, and this was also an important contribution. And then for the students, it's also very satisfying to see that other people continue their editing, other people add information to their pages. And then we also have the Scholars at Risk page, which again, we had a student working with us as an intern. Students had developed the page of the international NGO Scholars at Risk in English, and our student intern, again, who had taken part in the course, translated this page into Italian. So some student feedback on the project. Again, this was positive from both of the projects. The students saw themselves as a team, and as the students write, I think us as a team represented the Wikipedia community in miniature. I realize it's important to know how to work in a team. It's especially important lesson for me, since Wikipedia in its very essence is based on community and a collaborative effort of all the contributors from every part of the world. Another thing the student wrote, another interesting aspect of this platform are the discussions that can be generated amongst the users. Editing a source could also be a way to confront, this is from the Italian sense, so to share experience and knowledge with people around the world with different cultures and opinions. So it can be enriching not only under the aspect of exercising and improving in research and writing, but also from a socio-cultural perspective in the understanding of different opinions and approaches. Again, I don't know if you're aware, but every Wikipedia article has a talk page. On the talk page of the article, there are very often discussions about the article, about the edits to be made. And so with students, because they're studying, politics and some also contentious issues, we spend some time also looking at the discussion pages on some of the more controversial Wikipedia articles, because this is also a way to engage with the ecology of knowledge, the way different people view the issues being discussed. We also look at the edit pages. On Wikipedia, there is a history page, and you can see how many times a page has been edited. You can get a sense of the editing wars, so people making edits and edits being removed. So again, this idea of ecology of knowledge and how people engage with knowledge production is an interesting aspect that can be explored in Wikipedia and also in different languages. Students believe that it contributed to their understanding of this resource. So at the beginning of this project, I was skeptical on the use of Wikipedia because I thought it wasn't a great source of knowledge and references. And again, this is something that is often reinforced at university. Professors are always telling the students not to use Wikipedia, not to cite Wikipedia, which of course, Wikipedia isn't a source that you would cite. But research has found that students very often access Wikipedia to get an overview of their topic, to look for further resources to explore more in depth their topic. So it is something that I think we can't ignore. I think it's important, it's our responsibility to understand how it works better. And as the student says he learned, while working on the project, I learned that you couldn't change the pages on your own preference, but you need to reference and certificate all the information you put on it. Students also felt that their work was valued. Now, usually students write many essays, reports, and other papers, but it is very rare and therefore enormously precious when you know that there are other people who can find your page useful and learn something new from it. And again, I think I would emphasize that also for educators, how many papers do we mark? Who are students writing for? If you're actually correcting students' work that will then go public and be of use to other people than just for students getting a grade, I think it can also add value to our work as teachers and also to our work in correcting and students' work. And then also critical engagement with this concept of ecology of knowledges. Being a potentially controversial subject. So this was written by a student who wrote about English medium instruction, and he wanted to present a critical view of English medium instruction. So, what are the problems with it? What are the challenges? And he writes, being a potentially controversial subject, we put a great effort in using as language as neutral as possible, trying to avoid sources which could be perceived as biased. Another student wrote, the lack of representation of diversity among the editors in Wikipedia is also problematic. As shown in several studies, most contributions come from highly educated young male residents in Western countries. This implies an underrepresentation of women and other ethnic groups as editors, with the consequence that there is a risk of unevenness or systematic bias in the coverage of topics. So again, part of the Wikipedia project was for students to read some of the literature about Wikipedia and about the limitations and the systemic bias of Wikipedia. The University of Padua now has a Wikimedian in residence, and we're beginning on this project, but I think it's important to emphasize that we learned about this through the University of Edinburgh in particular. They started collaborating with Wikimedia in 2015, and they hosted a Wikimedian in residence in 2016. And from there, their project really has grown. They organize editathons. They have a lot of teaching staff using Wikipedia in their courses. And if you are interested in exploring this further, there is this very, very useful resource that the University of Edinburgh has published in collaboration with Wikimedia, which I strongly recommend you to read because it has case studies about using Wikipedia in education. And I think for us as language teachers, it's also possible to collaborate with other teachers from other subjects in terms of translating information in Wikipedia from one language to another on subjects that students are specializing in. Collaborating with distant teachers, in an intercultural exchange is another possibility for Wikipedia. So I think there are many, many, many ways that we can engage with Wikipedia as language teachers, as, in terms of exploring culture and ecologies of knowledge. And there are many, many resources also on Wikipedia itself. If you look up Wikipedia in education, and also I suggest this resource from the University of Edinburgh, and a recent publication by colleagues here, Valentina Gallo and Corrado Petrucco, who actually wrote a book, which again is open access, Wikipedia in Academia, with contributions from a wide range of lecturers in different subject areas on how Wikipedia can be used for teaching. And I think that's it, yes. So thank you for listening, and happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Francesca. it was really interesting. I think it gives us an insight of a different use of Wikipedia, at least a use different to the one we are used to. So I think
yes, I think people use it in a very passive way. It's used by, it's the fourth or fifth most explored website, but I think people are very passive in their use of it, students too.
Yes, and not only that, it's also some. I've got the feeling, I don't know if I'm the only one, but I've got the feeling that sometimes we, or teachers in general, we tell the students not to use it because it is not a reliable source, or not to use it too often, because the information they can find there is maybe not as reliable as if you find it in different places. However, students use it, of course, and it's good to know that, not only for us as lecturers, as teachers, that you can contribute. I knew we could contribute to it, but in a different way, in a more active way. And also for them, it is very, very interesting to know that they can also contribute and they can engage in different aspects, in social aspects, as you say. For instance, it's time for questions and answers. I hope you all enjoyed the lecture. And if you have any question, any comment, just write them in the chat, and Francesca will answer them.
Just one thing maybe I'll say, Guadalupe, I think, editing is actually quite difficult and it takes time to start using it. But I think also critically exploring Wikipedia, exploring the discussion pages, exploring the edits, is also a very useful way. Comparing pages in different languages is a very, can be an enriching, way of discovering more about it, I think.
Yeah, I think the main benefit, I'm a passive user of Wikipedia, but I think that some of the main possibilities or opportunities it offers are the different languages you can find the information in. And for instance, my son, he already uses it in English and Spanish to compare things when he has to do something for school, So it's useful. And also it is very dynamic and and it's easy to keep information updated. So that's something, when you compare it to traditional encyclopedias, it's something, of course, you can't find on a traditional encyclopedia, while you can find it here. Of course, that's something you have to take advantage of course. We've got a couple of questions from Adolfo Sanchez from the University of Granada. Well, he says he thanks you for the presentation, and he finds the project very interesting. He's got a couple of questions. One of them is, how do you handle feedback on the task? For instance, the language use. And also, what are the assessment criteria you use?
Okay, so in terms of feedback on the task, I actually go into the student sandbox, and I correct the language on it. It doesn't really leave you space for comments, but sometimes I will go and correct the language where it's problematic, where it's not clear for comprehension, reformulate some of the sentences perhaps, and then collaboratively in class go over some of the main issues that I encountered in their sandboxes, so in their draft forms of the articles. And in terms of assessment criteria, now ideally, and I do know some colleagues that use Wikipedia for assessment, and the criteria they use are actually whether it remains on the Wikipedia pages. So they allow, in a sense, the Wikipedia community to evaluate the articles. If an article is removed, then there are problems with that. I actually have students prepare a portfolio, and I evaluate in which they include various pieces of work. One of the pieces of work is their Wikipedia article, and then also a reflection piece on what they learned about Wikipedia through reading the article. The criteria for evaluating their article is, the clarity of the language, their referencing. So, how do they include suitable, reliable references? Is the format of the references correct? Is the language clear and easy to understand? And have they kind of met genre requirements? Wikipedia, it's an encyclopedic genre, so there is, there are certain words which you cannot use, which you shouldn't use because they are very subjective. So Wikipedia is useful in terms of helping students understand that genre of language and how to conform to it. So one of the criteria is whether they have actually, respected the genre, the requirements of Wikipedia writing.
Right. Yes. Well, I forgot to mention that Adolfo finds the project, which is, he thinks it's a real world and context-specific task, which I agree, of course. We've got someone whose name I can't pronounce. I'm really sorry because I don't know how to read Cyrillic alphabet. Thanks you for the lecture. And Adolfo again, he says it was very interesting, and he loves the idea of the project being part of a personal portfolio of learning evidences.
Mm-hmm. But this allows, if their edit isn't successful, they can still learn something from that. So that's why I don't use the kind of Wikipedia community criteria, also because that requires time for it. But I think if it's part of, evidence, and they can then reflect on that, what they learned, the mistakes they made as well, I think that's useful.
Okay. Any more questions or comments? Not at the moment. Or we can wait for a few minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that the lecture gives us a lot of ideas for using Wikipedia.
Yeah, it can be used, even passively, as I said before. But I think it's interesting also in terms of what is considered a language. Wikipedia has pages, in what people consider dialects. So there is Veneto, there is Sicilian, there is Basque, there is, different language and or dialects. In terms of the size of Wikipedia in the different language varieties, it's interesting because it's not, there are various criteria in measuring how large a Wikipedia is. So some of the largest Wikipedias have actually been created automatically by bots. And so that's not so representative. Obviously, the English language Wikipedia is the largest one. And it has the largest community also of active editors and of contributors to Wikipedia pages. But Italian, I think, is the 5th or 6th largest Wikipedia, which is interesting, and there is a big community, but not nearly the size of the English language one.
But it is interesting that Italian is the 6th one. Italian is not so widely spoken as English, so it's really it's very interesting.
It's very interesting, and I don't quite know why. I don't know whether it's because of the Wikimedia community, how active they have been in spreading knowledge or not. But it certainly is why.
Well, I don't know if anyone else would like to comment anything or to ask anything about this interesting project. I think we're receiving the questions and answers with a slight delay from so we just wait a few minutes. Well, Adolfo Sanchez again, he says he guesses it is also a good opportunity for students to learn about copyright issues and so on, in case they want to use images and third-party resources.
Absolutely, yes, because they can't. Obviously, I've had students upload images. One of the things we did is linguistic landscape. So we went exploring the linguistic landscape around Padua, and some of the students uploaded photographs that they themselves had taken. So again, that's becoming part of the Wikimedia community, uploading images, but you have to have copyright of the image, and you have to give, you have to give them free license to be reused. And Wikipedia actually also, in terms of copyright and plagiarism, is important, because students, if information is copied and pasted even from other Wikipedia pages, students need to specify. For example, in their sandbox, students copy and paste an article. They copy and paste it in their sandbox in order to modify it and to work on it. If they don't specify that this is what they have done, then their account will be closed for a short time, I think, because they're not respecting the rules of the community. So I think it's a very good way of helping students understand, what is permissible, what's not, what is plagiarism, what is not, and also understanding copyright and licensing.
Yeah. Yes, of course. It's a good way, a good resource to learn different things about different aspects of daily communication and daily use of IT resources and the web. So yeah.
It's really nice to follow it over time. So students have been following their own articles and see how they have been changed by other people, seeing if they've been translated, seeing if the visualizations increase. So there are a lot of kind of things on the back side of Wikipedia that's interesting to explore and learn to understand better as well. Because also, seeing how many people view a page on a certain topic is interesting. It gives you a sense of the importance of a topic and how relevant it is.
Yeah, true. Anyone else? Any more questions? Otherwise, we leave it here, because I know you are very busy, Francesca, as we all are, especially in this time of the year. But well, I don't want to leave without saying thank you, big thank you again to you and to everybody who is listening to us today. And thank you again for taking part in this series. Our next lecture will be in June, the 8th of June. And of course, all of you are welcome to it. And I think it is already, the information is already on the webpage, on Arqus webpage. So as I said, all of you are welcome. Thank you very much again, Francesca. Thank you very much, everybody. And we'll see you soon.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.